In the filthy heart of the city dump, where the air tasted of rot and rust and the sun made the discarded plastic glint like broken promises, Amos sat hunched beside the sofa he had hauled there, his baby girl curled against his chest, and for a long moment he simply watched her breathe, listening to the tiny rise and fall that anchored him to the world. He thought of Mary, her face like a pale photograph in his mind, and of all the small vows he had made in that hospital ward, of how he would be both father and mother, how hunger and heat and insult would never convince him to give up, and now here, with the sofa's secret compartment yawning open and revealing stacks of foreign currency that could buy lifetimes, he felt every emotion simultaneously: awe, terror, relief, doubt, and the small, fierce spark of reckless hope that made his hands shake as if they were working for the first time since his fall from ordinary life into the margins. He had no idea whose fortune this was, had no notion of the elaborate web such wealth might be tied into, but instinct told him two things at once. First, that this money could change everything for his daughter, that milk, a roof, a medicine, school fees, and a safer tomorrow could be pulled from these bundles like miracles, and second, that money does not remain ownerless for long in a world where men of power clip each other's wings in whispers and threats. Already his mind began to spin through possibilities: sell enough to get a room and steady food, invest a little to grow income. Never, he told himself, let anyone know he'd found it. Yet even as survival plans coagulated in his head, there was the other voice, the small, ethical thread tied to the memory of Mary's quiet hands, that urged him to think of consequences. If this belonged to a powerful man, taking it might mean danger not just for him but for the baby, and what father would trade safety for sudden fortune? He smoothed the currency with trembling fingers and imagined, briefly, walking into a bank, naming his daughter on an account that could bear a child's name and not a number, but prudence and the cold city air agreed that discretion was better than the bravado of redemption. At the same time, the name that reverberated through his thoughts, Chief Desmond, had not been unknown to him. The man's face stalked television screens and billboards, his voice filled halls and commandeered votes, and Amos remembered, with a little flare of shame, the morning he had begged at Desmond's car and been spat upon for his trouble. He could envision the chairman's rage, the way power twists rightful fury into hunt. His mind's eye pictured men in suits combing the streets, the sofa pulled apart by gloved hands, names fed to officers who would not hesitate to trample a sleeping man to get to a briefcase, to a secret compartment, to the seed money of an election. For a while he simply sat, clutching his child, the sofa's open cavity like a wound in the world's skin, and prayed like the desperate, because prayer was the language of the ruined who still hoped the world owed them mercy. Meanwhile, across town, Desmond's life began to fray at the edges like cheap cloth under a magnifying glass. What had been a comfortable arrogance, an administration of bribery carefully folded into his daily rituals, soured into panic when the discovery was reported. The master plan for the election, the envelopes of cash meant to grease palms and build illusions of consent, were not just numbers on paper but a tangible promise that he could not afford to see scatter into the wind. He returned to his mansion breathless with fury, ordering men to scour the dump, to summon the underbelly of the city to find the torsofa and the missing estate of illicit notes, and in his search his private life, the marriage that had stood like a showpiece for the cameras, crumbled. Clarissa's casual cruelty, a shrug over the household items, became a detonator for his rage, and he, who had been accustomed to bowing others to his will, found himself unmoored. He threw her out in a frenzy of accusation and humiliation, and those who once served the house packed and left too, whispering in alleyways about curses and the sudden, public fall of men who never learned humility until their towers toppled. The mansion emptied quickly. Servants, advisors, men who had counted on the chairman's largesse for their livelihoods deserted the place like a ship taking on water, and Desmond felt the rare, awful clarity of having less than he thought he did, no cushion now against scandal, no secret accounts to which he could run. The money had been real and immediate, and now it was gone, swallowed by an ordinary dump and perhaps the hands and heart of a man whose only crime, if it could be called that, was hunger. While Desmond marshaled his forces, both legal and brutal, Amos sat in the shade of an overturned crate, calculating the slow, careful steps required to convert the sofa's fortune into something that would not draw the hungry eyes of men like the chairman. One neighbor suggested discreetly selling a few bundles through a fence who took down cash for commodities. Another whispered about foreign exchange dealers who could launder notes into usable local currency, but Amos thought of Mary's face and the sound of his daughter's small breath and chose a different path, a plan stitched together from the small dignities left to him. He would not become a thief in the eyes of his conscience even if the law might someday label him so. Instead, he would try to find a safe way to use a sliver of what he needed to secure food and shelter without flaunting his windfall, and the rest, if it could be done, would be turned to the community that had once ignored him, for he could not bear to be the kind of man who hoarded when he could rescue others from the same cold nights his daughter had endured. So he tucked the sofa's secret into his shirt, wrapped the baby tighter, and limped through the city to the small clinic that owed him no favors, pleading for a reemployment opportunity while his mind plotted like a quiet engine. He took odd jobs where he could, refusing to show the cash to anyone, but at night, under the flicker of a kerosene lamp, he wrote down the names of neighbors who needed help and the amounts they required, making a ledger that mapped out a future in which hunger would not be a daily adjudicator of hope. The city moved like a beast around him, markets shouted, politicians promised from podiums, children chased one another through dusty alleys, and in a small compound near the dump a motherless child drifted towards sleep on a sofa that held the keys to a passing miracle. Yet the air carried the long shadow of danger. Men worth their weight in terror began to ask questions. Who had found the sofa? Who had claimed the discarded goods that day? Rumors arose like weeds. Some said it was the work of thieves, others whispered of activists who had stolen the money to redistribute it, and a handful, sharper-tongued, said it was an omen, a sign that even the powerful could not hide all their sins. Desmond, incapable of subtlety where his pride was concerned, ordered raids, checking scrap dealers, questioning street hawkers, and when threats did not yield, he turned to enforcers who had learned to answer in silence and force, men who would find the sofa and return it whole or return the finder in pieces. The city recoiled. Amos felt the ground shift beneath his feet, a neighbor's sudden disappearance, a van that prowled slowly past their sleeping shed in the night, the flap of Desmond's men's jackets like vultures in the periphery. Desmond spent the next days in chaos. His once commanding presence at political meetings had shifted. Whispers followed him everywhere, his enemies smelt blood in the water. The very allies who once groveled at his feet now questioned his decisions. His pride, his wealth, his certainty, it was all crumbling like a castle of sand washed away by the tide. But Amos, the homeless father, lived in another world entirely. Under the abandoned shed where he had hidden the sofa, nights turned restless. He would sit up for hours, staring at the bundles of money, whispering to himself, "Is this real? Can this really be mine?" He would look at his sleeping daughter, her fragile chest rising and falling, and his heart would burn with hope. With this money, she would never starve again. She would go to the best schools, dress in clean clothes, sleep on a real bed. Yet, alongside the hope came an unshakable fear. What if they come looking? What if this belongs to someone powerful? What if? His thoughts tore at him day and night. He told no one. Not even the kind old beggar who sometimes shared roasted corn with him. The secret pressed against his chest like a heavy stone. Meanwhile, Desmond had unleashed a storm. He sent his loyal bodyguards into the streets, searching the dumps, interrogating waste workers, and threatening anyone who may have seen the sofa. Posters were pasted discreetly with false information, offering rewards for anyone who returned lost property. But those who knew Desmond understood his reward was nothing but a trap. Clarissa, thrown out of the mansion, wandered back to her family's old estate in shame. She had once lived like a queen, yet now she sat on a rickety chair with tears streaming down her cheeks. Isabella, her daughter, called from America. "Mama, what's going on? Papa hasn't answered my calls." "What happened?" Clarissa hesitated, then broke down. "Your father, he has lost everything. And he has thrown me away like rubbish. Isabella, the man you think is your hero, he hides things, terrible things. The truth, piece by piece, started leaking. A journalist picked up whispers about the missing sofa. Rumors spread that the chairman had lost millions. Opposition members of the party saw their chance. They would expose him, break his power, and end his reign. Back under the bridge, Amos was torn between survival and safety. Each time he thought of touching the money, his body shook. He knew nothing about banks, about investments, about keeping such fortune safe. If he stepped wrongly, the very people he feared could smell him out. But hunger pressed harder every day. One night, as his daughter cried with fever, Amos looked at the bundles again. He clenched his fist. This money cannot just sit here while she suffers. I will use it. Even if it kills me, I will use it. The next morning, Amos carefully wrapped a few bundles in an old sack and walked to a small chemist in the market. The chemist, shocked to see so much cash in foreign notes, asked too many questions. Amos' heart pounded. He quickly exchanged only a small part of it, pretending he had a relative abroad who sent him the money. With the little he got, he bought medicine, food, clean clothes, and for the first time in months, he and his daughter ate a meal until their stomachs were full. But word travels fast in the city. By evening, whispers reached the ears of a shady money changer. There's a beggar who paid in dollars today. A beggar. The man's curiosity burned like fire. He set out to find Amos. At the same time, Desmond had unleashed a private investigator, a man feared across the state, Inspector Boko. Known for his ruthless efficiency, Boko had brought down many of Desmond's enemies in the past. Now, he was given one mission: find the sofa, find the money, at all cost. And so, two words began to circle Amos like vultures: the greedy streets and the powerful throne he never dared approach. That night, as Amos held his sleeping child, he whispered to her again, just as he had on the day her mother died. I promised you greatness. Maybe this is God's way of keeping that promise. But, oh, my child, will this be our blessing, or our curse? Meanwhile, Desmond sat alone in his mansion, the silence deafening. For the first time in his life, he tasted fear, the kind of fear the poor lived with daily. Fear of hunger. Fear of tomorrow. Fear of losing everything. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hand trembling. Whoever you are, he muttered into the empty air, whoever has my money, know this: you cannot escape me. Not in this city. Not in this life. Christopher and Nora's reconciliation had brought light back into their home, but life in Lagos never stopped testing them. 6 months of counseling and rebuilding had smoothed many cracks, but the road ahead was still filled with challenges neither of them could have predicted. One humid Sunday morning, the Johnson household bustled with noise. Grace hummed while brushing her doll's hair, Samuel sprinted from room to room, and Daniel sprawled across the floor sketching in his notebook. Christopher had just finished frying plantains when Nora emerged from their bedroom, adjusting the strap of her sundress. She had the same look of focus she often carried before making an important announcement. Family meeting, she said, clapping her hands once. The children froze mid-motion, Samuel pausing mid-sprint with a toy car still in his hand. Christopher raised an eyebrow but quickly obeyed, wiping his hands on a towel before sitting at the table. What's this about? He asked. Nora smiled faintly, her eyes scanning their faces. I've been offered a promotion. Head of Regional Operations. It means more responsibility, more pay, but also more travel. The children gasped in unison. Daniel looked up sharply. Does that mean you won't be home anymore? Nora shook her head quickly. Not like that, sweetheart. I'd still be home most nights, but sometimes I'd have to visit other branches, Abuja, Port Harcourt, maybe even Ghana. Christopher's chest tightened. He was proud of her, deeply so, but part of him worried about slipping back into old patterns, the ones where work swallowed one of them whole, leaving the other to carry the weight of family alone. "That's big news," he said carefully. "It is," Nora agreed. "But I wanted us to talk about it together. No secrets, no surprises." She glanced at him, as though reminding him of the very lesson that had nearly cost them everything. Grace raised her hand as though she were in school. "Will you still talk us in?" Nora leaned forward, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Always. Even if it's late, I'll come find you." Samoa frowned. "And family game night. You promised no more counseling." Christopher smiled at his son's stubbornness. "Don't worry, champ. If mommy's busy, daddy will host game night. But she'll join when she's home, won't you, Nora?" Nora squeezed his hand. "I wouldn't miss it." The decision wasn't simple. Over the next week, Christopher and Nora spoke about it late into the night, weighing the pros and cons. Money would be helpful. They could finally fix the leaking roof, pay for the children's extracurriculars, maybe even save for university. But more travel meant more strain. Christopher promised himself that if she accepted, he would step up fully, not halfway, not grudgingly, but with genuine partnership. At counseling, their therapist, Mrs. Adeyemi, listened quietly as they debated. Finally, she said, "Marriage is like dancing. Sometimes one leads, sometimes the other. What matters is that both keep moving in rhythm." "Christopher, can you support Nora without resentment?" "Nora, can you trust Christopher without hovering?" If you can both answer yes, then you're ready for this step. They looked at each other, and after a pause, both nodded. Nora accepted the promotion. The rainy season rolled into Lagos with heavy skies and air thick with the smell of wet earth. For the Johnson family, the sound of the rain on the tin roof had always been both comforting and unsettling, a reminder of storms past and the fragile peace they now guarded with care. It had been nearly 3 years since Nora withdrew her petition for divorce, and though the shadows of that painful chapter lingered, their home was filled with more laughter than tears, more hope than despair. Yet, as Christopher and Nora had come to understand, marriage was not a final destination, but a journey that demanded attention, humility, and courage every single day. Life had settled into a rhythm. Christopher rose early to prepare the children for school, often humming gospel songs under his breath as he fried plantains or stirred a pot of ogi. Grace, now 12, had developed a flair for dramatics. She sang constantly, her voice carrying through the house like a bird that refused to be caged. Samuel, equally 12 but far more restless, could rarely sit still, his energy filling every corner of their home. And Daniel, quiet yet sharp-eyed, kept journals stacked high with sketches, stories, and questions about the world. Their triplets were growing, and with them, the challenges of raising children who were no longer babies but not quite adults either. Nora's promotion had stabilized, and she had found a way to balance career ambition with her role at home. Her health scare had been the wake-up call she needed, and she now guarded her boundaries fiercely, ensuring she didn't slip back into overwork. She traveled sometimes, Abuja, Port Harcourt, and even briefly to Accra, but she always returned with gifts for the children and a kiss for Christopher that lingered just long enough to reassure him she belonged nowhere else but home. Then, one evening, as they all gathered around the dinner table, great-grandmama Rose's name came up again. The old matriarch, now living in her village, had not visited Lagos in almost a year. The children missed her stories, her stern corrections, and the warmth of her embrace. "Can we visit her?" Grace asked between bites of jollof rice. "She always says she's too old to keep traveling. Maybe it's our turn." Nora looked at Christopher, and he nodded. "It's been too long," he agreed. "We'll go this Christmas." The trip was long and tiring, but the sight of Rose waiting for them at her doorway, frail, smaller than they remembered, but with eyes sharp as ever, made the journey worthwhile. She scolded Christopher for not calling enough, lectured Nora on resting properly, and pulled the children into her lap despite their protests that they were too big. That evening, as the family gathered under the stars, Rose told them, "Love is not proven in good days. It is proven in storms. You too," she gestured at Christopher and Nora, "have already survived your storm. Don't wait for another to remember what you promised." Those words lingered with Christopher, and he found himself thinking about them often in the months that followed. But life, as always, had a way of testing promises. One Monday morning, Christopher arrived at work only to discover that the company he had been loyal to for nearly 2 decades was downsizing. His department was dissolved overnight. The severance pay was modest, but it couldn't match the weight of his disappointment. He returned home earlier than usual, the layoff letter folded tightly in his pocket, and for hours he sat silently on the balcony, staring at the bustling streets below. Nora found him there. She sat beside him, placing her hand over his. "You've carried us for so long, Chris. It's all right to rest. We'll figure this out together." But Christopher felt stripped of something essential, his role as provider. For weeks, he drifted in a fog, pretending for the children's sake but shrinking inward at night. It was Nora who reminded him, gently and persistently, that his worth was not tied to a title or paycheck. She encouraged him to pursue what he had always spoken about but never dared to try, opening his own small logistics business. With her support, and even Matthew's surprising help, his brother now sober and working steadily, they began laying the groundwork. The children noticed the change too. Grace, in her dramatic flair, announced one evening, "Daddy, you look alive again. Like you're writing your own story instead of reading someone else's." Samuel clapped him on the back, beaming with pride. And Daniel, ever observant, began helping him sketch out ideas for company logos. It was not easy. The first months were brutal, clients were scarce, bills piled up, and doubt crept in. But each time Christopher faltered, Nora steadied him. "We've been through worse," she reminded him. "We survived almost losing each other. We can survive this too." Slowly, business grew. A few contracts turned into steady work, and though they were not wealthy, they were stable. Just as the Johnsons found their footing, another challenge arose, this one not financial, but personal. Grace, their eldest by mere minutes, came home one afternoon in tears. She had been teased at school, mocked for her accent during choir rehearsal. Nora held her close, whispering affirmations, while Christopher listened quietly, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "People will always find something to say," he told her later that night. "But you cannot let their words shrink you. Your voice is a gift, Grace. Use it." To show his support, Christopher attended her next performance, front row, clapping the loudest, his cheers drowning out every sneer. Grace's confidence soared, and she sang with a conviction that silenced her critics. It was a reminder that fatherhood was not about grand gestures, but about being present when it mattered most. Meanwhile, Samuel's boundless energy found a home in athletics. He trained tirelessly, dreaming of representing Lagos in inter-school competitions. One evening, while Nora was away on a short trip, Christopher took Samuel to practice. Watching his son sprint across the track, determination etched into every stride, filled him with awe. Yet Samuel's competitive spirit sometimes bred arrogance, and after one particularly heated game, he came home sulking, furious at his teammates. "You're not just running for yourself," Christopher told him firmly. "A true champion lifts others up, even when they stumble." Samuel rolled his eyes but later apologized to his team, and in that moment, Christopher knew his son was learning lessons that mattered far beyond the finish line. Daniel, the quiet dreamer, remained a puzzle. He wrote constantly, poems, short stories, plays, but rarely shared them. One night, Christopher stumbled upon a notebook left open on the dining table. It contained a story about a family on the brink of falling apart, only to be saved by love and second chances. Christopher's chest ached as he read, realizing his son had been watching, absorbing everything all along. "You should show this to your mother," Christopher told him. Daniel hesitated. "What if it's not good enough?" Christopher smiled softly. "Son, sometimes the story doesn't have to be perfect. Sometimes it just has to be true." Nora wept when she read it, pulling Daniel into her arms. That night, she told Christopher, "Our children are growing into themselves, and it's because they've seen us grow too." Years continued to unfold, carrying both joy and sorrow. Great-grandmama Rose eventually passed, her final words a blessing whispered into Nora's ear: "Take care of each other. That is the true inheritance." Her death was a heavy blow, but it also cemented the Johnsons' bond, reminding them that life was fragile, and love too precious to neglect.